Today we have 3 stories of lost treasure in Arkansas. First, an elderly man shows up in a small town with a map. One of the locals in the area recognizes the location on the map and they go in search of an abandoned silver mine. Next is the story of a train holdup where $12,000 in gold coins is stolen. The last surviving member of the gang reveals the location of the buried treasure on his deathbed. Finally, a group of Native Americans have to bury gold and silver by a river because an attack by robbers is imminent. Welcome to Hidden Treasures, where we tell stories of lost treasure, mysteries, any stories that I find interesting, and hopefully you do too. Thanks for watching. In the early 1700s, in what is now Boone County, Arkansas, there was a Spanish silver mine. The Spanish mined this area for years until the word got out that they were actually pulling some silver. Once word got out, there was a tribe of hostile natives in the area that began attacking the miners. The Spanish realized very quickly that the amount of silver that they were pulling out was not worth these constant attacks from the natives. So they eventually just packed everything up and abandoned the mine. The natives in the area, along with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, made it difficult for the Spanish to come back and ever try and find and reclaim this mine. So this mine largely just became forgotten until 1880. In 1880, an elderly Spanish man walked into a local store in Batavia owned by a man named JERRYE. The elderly Spanish man was looking for a local in the area because he had this old map that he knew was of this area, but since he wasn't from there, he didn't know any of the landmarks. But when he showed this map to JERRYE, who was a local, he immediately recognized the landmarks on the map and knew exactly where this silver mine was. The next day, JERRYE closed up his store and he, his son, and the elderly Spanish man went to the location of this lost mine. They went to a local landmark named Pilot Knob. They found a rock on top of the mountain. 100 yards to the southwest of this large rock was a stream. They then paced off 200 yards straight north of the stream. After pacing off the 200 yards, JERRYE stopped and he told his son and he told the Spaniard, "This is the location on the map." They began digging at exactly that spot, and after about 6 feet of digging, the ground opened up into a small cavern. Inside this small cavern, they found a skeleton. They pulled out the bones and kept digging around until they found walls, and when they found these walls, they knew that they were in a man-made cave. They immediately staked claims all around this area and began digging, looking for this silver mine. They dug and dug and dug up all of the area around all of their claims, and they didn't find anything. There is an abandoned silver mine somewhere around Pilot Knob, Arkansas that still has not been found. On October 17, 1899, $12,000 worth of gold was being transported from West Helena to Jonesboro, Arkansas. The train carrying this gold was approaching a bridge over Crow Creek when all of a sudden the bridge in front of them exploded. The train was able to stop before it went careening into the creek, but as soon as they got stopped, 3 armed and masked men jumped on board the train. One of the masked men held the crew captive at gunpoint, while the other 2 set dynamite below the train car that held the safe containing the gold. So these 3 men knew when the train was going to be there, they knew that it was carrying this gold, and they knew which car the gold was being carried in. So these men were clearly either tipped off or it was an inside job. When these men detonated this dynamite, the railroad car was completely blown to bits. Everything in it was blown out and it was strung all over the place, and 2 guards died in the explosion. After the explosion, the 3 men were easily able to pry open the strongbox and take out the $12,000 worth of gold. They divided the gold up evenly amongst themselves, placed it in their saddlebags, and took off into the woods. Of course, gold is very heavy, and most outlaws at the time would quickly get caught because they didn't take this into account. However, these guys actually made it quite a ways. Once these guys disappeared into the woods and were on the run, posses formed in Forest City and West Helena. These posses started tracking these men, and after about 3 days, they started getting pretty close. These men also knew that they were going slow, and after about 3 days, they had this feeling that they were about to get caught. These men were at the fork of the White River and Cypress Bayou in Prairie County when they decided to take a little bit of their gold for themselves and then bury the rest of it. They also made a pact that they would come back on December 25th, Christmas Day, when nobody would be around and they could recover the gold that they had buried. So this is what they did. They just took a little bit of gold for themselves and then they took off on their horses to try and get away. However, this didn't work out either. The first man to be caught only 2 days after burying the gold and 5 days after the initial robbery, the first man, Max Perry, was actually shot by a farmer while trying to steal a horse. The next robber to be caught was Roy Hutton. He was actually shot by a sheriff's deputy in Clarendon, Arkansas. The third man, Walter Drake, was caught in Search, Arkansas, stood trial, and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. During the time that he was on trial and the first few years while he was in prison, many people tried to find out what happened to the gold as it had never been recovered, and he wouldn't tell anyone. After about 2 years in prison, he got a new cellmate who was a murderer named Billy Joe Gordon, and these two quickly became friends. After about 5 years of these two being cellmates and really close friends, Drake got an unknown illness and he was about to die. But before he died, he told his new friend Gordon exactly where that treasure had been buried. Drake told Gordon that 400 feet straight south of the fork between the White River and Cypress Bayou was a giant oak tree that was very out of place. Continue walking past that oak tree 45 paces, and that is the location of the buried $12,000 worth of gold coins. Of course, Gordon was in prison for a very long time for murder, but he did eventually get out. And as soon as he got out, the first thing he did was to go to Prairie County to the fork of the White River and Cypress Bayou and try and find this treasure. Unfortunately, he had been in prison so long that the terrain had changed and he couldn't even find this giant oak tree. Now the terrain has changed even more and the fork in the river probably isn't anywhere near where it was back then. That out of place giant oak tree is probably still there if there hasn't been any fires or anything like that in the region. But considering the fork in the river has probably dramatically changed, trying to walk 400 yards south and find an oak tree would be extremely difficult. But somewhere out there, there is $12,000 worth of gold buried and no one has ever found it to this day. In 1863, a group of 3 to 5 Native Americans were traveling from western Missouri to their homes in Native territory in Oklahoma. The natives were traveling with 3 large wagons, which made travel slow, but they also had 2 kettles that were filled with jewels and silver and gold. At some point, a group of white men noticed these natives and began following them. There are 2 conflicting stories as to where these 2 kettles filled with this treasure came from. One of the stories comes from the natives, the other story comes from the white men that were following the natives. So the first story from the men that were following the natives was that these natives had gone into western Missouri, had raided several small villages, and had stolen this money, and the men were simply tracking the natives so they could arrest them, recover the money, and give it back to the villagers. So the story from the natives was that they had legally obtained these riches by trading in western Missouri, and they were just on their way back home to Oklahoma territory. Either way, these natives were slow moving through Missouri, these men were after them, and they knew that these men were after them. At some point, the natives discovered that these men were tracking them and that they were getting closer and closer, and they figured that these guys were probably going to rob them and that an attack was imminent. So under the cover of darkness, when they knew that these men were very close to them and that they were probably about to be attacked, 2 of the natives took these 2 kettles and went several paces off of the road that they were on and buried the kettles. While they were burying these 2 kettles, the remaining men gathered up the wagons and all non-essential items, put put them in a pile, and set them on fire. Knowing that this fire was surely going to be seen by the men that were chasing them, they hopped on their horses and they got out of there. This story actually comes from an elderly Cherokee native who was the only remaining member of this group that buried the treasure. After the Civil War, him being the only remaining member of this group, he went back to try and find this treasure, but after the war, there had been many homes that had been built, many large areas of land had been cleared for farming, and the terrain was just completely different. Because of this huge difference in the terrain, he was completely unable to find any area where they had buried this treasure. He was able to find Bee Creek, and he knew that the road that they had been on was a road that followed Bee Creek, and that they had buried the treasure several paces off of the road. So assuming that Bee Creek hasn't changed its path too much in the last 150 years, somewhere out there just a few paces away from Bee Creek is 2 kettles filled with gold and silver. I hope you enjoyed the stories. If so, don't forget to like, leave comments, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.